We're going to look at some of the key differences between the newly released Fujifilm X-T5 and the Fujifilm X-H2, which is also a very new camera, both of which are lovely cameras. We've reviewed both of them, and I'll pop links to the reviews down in the description. I might put them in the comments as well, just to make it super easy to go and look at those videos. But how exactly do you choose between those two cameras? That can be a little bit difficult because they're both very good, but there are some differences for us to talk about. So let's take a look at both of them. Let's go through it from a photo standpoint, from a video standpoint. What are you going to get with each camera? Now, the first thing to really consider is that there is a little bit of a different feel to both of the cameras, and that's very deliberate. They're designed differently. So the X-T5, for example, has a very specific feel. It's got the shutter dial, the ISO dial, and it really feels like you are, using the camera, really getting in there. It has a bit more of an analog feel to it when you are taking photos. And some people really, really like that. I think the actual process of using an X-T5, or really any of the X-T cameras, it can really feel like you're more hands-on with the photography. And some people just like using the dials actually on top of the camera and being able to see that kind of thing and having that slightly more analog feel. So that's something to consider. I've always felt like the X-T series of cameras have always been a very good photographic series of cameras, and that's certainly true with the X-T5, although it does have some great video spec as well. So with that said about the feel of the X-T5, whereas the X-H2 is still a great feeling camera, but it doesn't have that kind of more analog feel that you can get with something like X-T camera. With that all said, let's get into some of the spec and where some of these key differences lie. Now, both the X-H2 and the X-T5 both have a 40 megapixel sensor. So you're getting a really high resolution image there, lots of room to crop. The X-T5 actually has a digital teleconverter, so you can use 1.4 times or 2 times converter inside the camera to zoom in like that. But both of them have a nice high detail, high resolution sensor. That's something to bear in mind with the X-H2S, which does actually have a lower megapixel count, 26 megapixels, still more than enough realistically, but less room to crop than on the X-H2 and the X-T5. Now, even though the X-H2 and the X-T5 will both shoot up to 15 frames a second in burst shooting mode, there is quite a big difference on the buffer. The X-T5, because it uses just SD cards, has a much smaller buffer. So you're looking at 119 JPEGs or 19 RAW images, whereas the X-H2 is able to use a buffer of 1000 plus JPEGs, and actually, I'm not even sure where that would top out, or 400 RAW photos. So because the X-H2 is using a CF Express card, or an SD, it's able to get a lot more from the buffer. Whereas just using the SD cards, the X-T5 is getting a much smaller buffer. That's something to be aware of. Now, of course, the X-H2S, with that smaller megapixel count, is able to get 1000 plus JPEGs or 1000 RAW photos on the buffer. So if you're looking for speed and kind of continuous shooting like that, the X-H2S is the one to look at. That'll also shoot up to 40 frames a second in the burst shooting mode. In terms of autofocus, it's very similar from the X-H2, the X-H2S, and the X-T5. They all have a very, very similar autofocus system, 425 points, so you're not going to see much difference there. That also goes for in-body image stabilization as well, where you're getting up to 7 stops. Now, it works really well, but it works really well across the range. Now, in terms of video specs, all of these cameras are pretty serious when it comes to video as well as photo. But let's talk about some of the differences here. So the X-T5, let's start there. Internal, that'll shoot 6.2K up to 30 frames a second, 4K up to 60 frames a second. It'll shoot 422 10-bit as well. And then you've got 12-bit RAW video external. Now the X-H2 has got a similar kind of spec, but it'll be able to shoot 8K up to 30 frames a second. You can still do 6.2K, 30 frames a second, 4K, 60, 422 10-bit. And of course, you've still got that 12-bit RAW external. So similar sort of spec, but you can get all the way up to 8K video there, up to 30 frames a second. So a little bit more powerful. Now on the X-H2S, we see some interesting alternative options as well. So for example, we have 4K 120, we have the 6.2K, 30 frames a second, 422 10-bit, and then the 12-bit RAW external again. So I really like that 4K 120 frames a second. I love the workflow of using that kind of frame rate with the detail of 4K. There's just so much you can do with that. Such a creative way to shoot, because you can add zooms, you can rotate the image, you can do all kinds of stuff in post because you have so much more detail, so much more resolution to play with when you actually come to edit that footage. Of course, 6.2K is still really good. We don't quite see the 8K that we see in the X-H2, and that's just because of the megapixel count, but it's still a very nice, highly detailed resolution to kind of play around with. Now, we've mentioned the cards that the cameras take. The X-T5, of course, takes 2 SD cards, whereas the X-H2 and the X-H2S take an SD card or a CF Express card as well. But what about the overall design of the cameras? Well, let's talk about the EVF and the LCD screen. Now, the EVF on the X-H2S and the X-H2 are beautiful. They're 5.76 million dots. It looks fantastic when you're looking through there, and it's 120 frames a second. So it's the kind of EVF that you forget you're using an EVF. It looks just so good. Now the X-T5 is good as well, but it is a lower resolution. We're talking 3.69 million dots, and it's 100 frames a second. Now realistically, it still looks fantastic, but it is slightly noticeable that the X-H2 looks a little bit nicer. Now the screen is vari-angle on the X-H2 and the X-H2S, which means it can flip all the way around. Great for content creators, great for videographers, a really useful thing. Whereas the X-T5 has a 3-axis tiltable screen, more in line with the X-T3, which is something you're either going to love or hate. Personally, I think on reflection, given enough time since I've been using the camera, I actually wish that it was like the X-T4 where the screen did flip out all the way out. I really like that. I think it's very useful. And especially for someone like me who does stuff like this, it would be very useful to have the flip out screen to be able to see myself like that. I think taking it back to the X-T3 makes it feel more like a photo camera more than a video camera, which I totally understand. And I think a lot of people will really like that, but you're probably in one camp or the other. And for that reason, there's a good reason to look at either the X-H2 or the X-T5 there. If video is important to you, then the X-H2 with that flip out screen like that might just be the better option. And of course, the X-H2S has that 4K 120 as well, which I think is fantastic. In terms of connections, again, the X-H2 and the X-H2S, HDMI, microphone, headphone, whereas on the X-T5, yes, we have a microphone input, but we don't have headphone and we only have micro HDMI. Just another thing that makes it feel not so much like a video system, even though bizarrely, it actually has a great video spec. But that does mean, if you're looking at video spec in particular, again, this is another reason the X-H2 and the X-H2S are probably the ones to look at. In terms of the battery life, we're actually getting slightly better performance out of the X-T5. I think that's probably just because it's not working as hard. So we're looking at 740 shots on one battery charge, whereas 680 on the X-H2. I think that's probably, to be honest with you, is probably pretty comparable. And these kind of estimates are usually pretty low anyway. I didn't really notice a difference when I was using the two cameras, so it's probably not that much of a thing to actually consider when you're looking at these two. Other things that are worth noting is that the X-H2 has a cooling fan, same as the X-H2S, whereas the X-T5 doesn't. That might be where the battery life is changing a little bit there, but probably not something to worry too much about. But with that higher resolution on the video side of things, that is probably where the cooling fan is more necessary. And the last thing to consider with these two cameras or three cameras is the price, because the X-H2 is a couple of £100 more expensive than the X-T5. And then the X-H2S is quite a bit more expensive again. So there's a lot to consider there. Now, my honest feelings are that if you are just a photographer, not a videographer, not a hybrid shooter, if you just shoot photos, then the X-T5 is a lovely camera to use for that. It has everything that you might want there. It has great resolution, great specs. It's pretty fast as well. I think it's absolutely great as a photography camera. Now, it can be great as a hybrid camera as well for video, but I think if you're considering video, I think if that's a big enough part of what you shoot, it's probably worth going for the X-H2 or the X-H2S. Personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I would probably lean towards the X-H2. I think in terms of price to performance, I think the X-H2 offers probably the best performance to the price. Would I miss the 4K 120? Yes, I would, absolutely. That would be a great thing to have. But I think I could probably live with that with the X-H2. I think the 40 megapixels is going to be very useful for a lot of photography work. I think it's a fantastic video system as well. And I like the price point, if I'm honest with you. So that is a great option to go for. I think the X-H2 is a fantastic camera, and that's probably the one I would choose. However, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the other two either. I think they're great options. It just depends on what you shoot. I think if you shoot it almost exclusively video, X-H2S. If you shoot almost exclusively photography, the X-T5. And if you are that hybrid shooter, like I am, I would probably go for the X-H2. So I hope that's somewhat helpful. We've gone through some of the differences there, and I've given you my honest opinion on what I would choose and how I would work out my decision on those cameras. If you want to look at those cameras and check the full spec and the pricing and all that stuff, you can check them out by following the links down in the description. I'll put links for all three of the cameras down there so you can check them out. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for new content every week. I'll be seeing you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.